Granblue Fantasy Relink. So yeah, I don't like this game, and I'm gonna give some reasons as to why, and I will be rather harsh about it. Everything I'm about to say is based on my personal experience and perspective on things, so don't take this as some kind of fair game review or whatever. I'll mostly be judging this game from these three main points. 1. How this game being too RNG dependent ruins its fundamental systems. 2. How it tried too hard with its appearances and instead gave off a superficial kind of impression. And 3. How the game feels hollow because it lacks actual substance and does not encourage player engagement. Another reason for me making this video, other than just the fact that I want to complain about this game, is because of how I see people like to compare it to other games, like Monster Hunter or Final Fantasy XIV. And honestly, I think that's just really inaccurate. So throughout the video, I'll also be going over some of the comparisons made in where it fits, and hopefully be able to convince you that these games are not comparable in the slightest in where it really matters. Now let's begin with my first main issue with the game.
Let's go gambling!
Having RNG in a game in itself is not the problem. It is not because the game has RNG that I dislike it so much, but it is due to how they chose to implement RNG into the very core of the game's systems that really irritated me. Because of RNG, I do not feel like my time and effort invested into the game are actually properly respected. And at the center of it all, the main offender, I believe, is the sigil system. And since there are some comparisons made on this with decorations in World Iceborne, I'll talk a bit on that first. The main distinguishing factor between the sigils in Relink and the decorations in World Iceborne is their role and level of importance in their respective games. Decorations in World Iceborne is more about improving your power ceiling in the game, while sigils is the determined factor of your power foundation in the game. And this difference also determines the difference in player impression and mentality when it comes to dealing with them. In World Iceborne, decorations are just means to the end of getting your armor skills, but that could also be done through just crafting the appropriate armor pieces, which is much less RNG dependent. In Relink, the sigils also are just the means to get the appropriate traits, but the big difference here is that the sigils are the only real source to get the traits from. This means if you're unlucky with the RNG, there is nothing else within the game's available systems to really help compensate and make the unfortunate situations feel less bad. Imagine in World Iceborne and not having any armor and only decorations to get your armor skills from. That's what Relink is basically like. Not to mention the character sigils, which has its own kind of RNG where you can't even guarantee to get the ones you want for the character you want to play. The entire premise is like telling you that in World Iceborne, when you play Insect Glaive for example, you'll only have access to one type of essence because you don't have the specific decorations to unlock the other two. But Relink's RNG sigil system is frustrating to deal with, not only because of how it impacts your character's fundamental power level, but also how it removes any real sense of progression. Because the player has little control over what they get, it creates an all or nothing kind of situation for your character's power level progression. Instead of having a slow and steady progression slope, it is a bunch of cliffs instead. And it's not like you get to climb these cliffs because you have proven to be good at the game. Because this is all RNG, you get to climb when the game feels like it. And that is just disheartening. Transmuting sigils, combining sigils, relics, everything that's related to the core system of the game is a gacha of some kind. But of course, Relink still has some ways to guarantee your sigil drops, like through quest rewards, and how the alpha, beta, and gamma sigils, which from now on I'll just call them Lucilia sigils, are obtained from material trade-ins. But the thing is, most of these guaranteed sigils are basically unwanted trash that you're gonna trade in for transmuting RNG sigils instead. What most of the quests give are not really sigils, but instead are more like currencies for you to pull that lever more. And this is not just me being an elitist or whatever and undervaluing the guaranteed sigils. Because remember that sigils can have this extra plus sign behind it, which means it can have an entirely new effect attached to it, essentially doubling the sigil's value, granting 2 different traits in one single sigil slot. This removes the non-V+ sigils most of their purpose for even existing in the game, and creates a situation where having the V+ sigils is now the new baseline. The only boss that actually guarantees good V+ sigils is Lucilius. But this is a weird case where it's like you need the good sigils to fight Lucilius, but it is Lucilius who gives you the better sigils. So basically before Lucilius, you're going to be trapped in the RNG hell for quite a while before actually making much progress. It is a progression cliff issue again. Oh, and don't think I've forgotten about the Lucilius sigils. Even when it came to the absolute endgame, the materials needed to trade for these sigils are still not guaranteed, because it is possible for Lucilius to drop 0 tears of Apocalypse, and at most 3, when you need 5 to trade for a single Lucilius sigil. If this is not artificially padding out the playtime, then I don't know what is. This is just a forced grind at this point, accompanied with bad RNG, and you have to fight the same boss over and over again for that. Like, that's just really boring to deal with. I mean, with farming decorations, you at least get to fight all sorts of different things. You even get a bit of personal choice and agency in the matter, where you can go like, I think I want to fight this guy instead this time. Being stuck with just one really feels awful. Initially, I was trying to see if I could compare Lucilius to World Iceborne's Fatalis, but then I remembered I only really did like 4 to 5 full runs to get a full armor set, with guaranteed key material drop if I broke the correct parts. So once again, it's not the same kind of RNG implemented, and one actually has something extra that respects player effort. But maybe there is something that's actually comparable in terms of RNG in World Iceborne to Relink. The Safi and KT weapons to the Terminus weapons. But oh wait, never mind, because one rewards you with better RNG for actually playing better and breaking more parts, while the other just has a dead set percentage no matter how well you did. Also, one of them is not about fishing for the literal best weapon, just one of the many best, because the game has an actually deep, diverse, and non-linear system behind it that allows for other weapons and playstyles to shine. While with the other game, it is the literal best weapon you're going for, so you're kind of forced to farm for the same shitty fight over and over again. The same scenario as Lucilius. You're still at the mercy of RNG with no compensation or some kind of safety net. Like, I know that the IP originated from a gacha mobile game, but that shouldn't be the excuse for this kind of game design. It's really putting me off, and I can't stop being cynical about all of this and think that this whole thing was just purposefully made this way to create more gambling addicts, or at least make people more accustomed to gacha, to then lead them towards the mobile game that has the real money gachas. I'll be honest here, I'm definitely being biased because I've never really respected gacha games much in the first place, since I just see them as glorified gambling machines, that they are slot machines first, games second. I came into this game knowing that it came from a background of gacha games, but I thought I would give it a chance since this is an actual full-price game without any microtransactions that will affect gameplay in any significant way. but I never thought that the gambling aspect would still be so prominent here. And I've just lost all of my patience for this product after smelling this intense stench of a mobile gacha game it's giving off. In fact, I'm pretty sure this game could have a perfect mobile game port without changing literally anything about it, and it would still play the same. I truly think that this game was designed very hastily, with little to no effort or thought given to the gameplay, the bosses, the progression system, the story, just everything about it makes it feel like a cash grab more than anything. Like, you know what? Forget about the conspiracy theory I had about how this game is making people more used to gacha mechanics. I think they were just lazy and never had any good ideas in the first place when making this game and just said, what should be the fundamental system that everything this game runs on? Gacha. Since that is the only thing we really know how to make. I mean, I'll be a bit more forgiving here and say that maybe they never meant this to be a serious game for the general public to play. Maybe they just saw this as like a fan service for those who actually followed the Granblue Fantasy IP. But everything this game has, how it looks, how it plays, the story, the music, the characters, the environment, all feel like they're there to just distract you from the fact that you're really just playing another gacha game. Also, the microtransaction thing is actually kind of false because they do have this DLC in the store page that sells you the supplementary damage sigil. It is weird to see people praising this game and saying that this game not having microtransactions is like a positive point for a game. Like, should we really praise something for not doing what is undesirable to people? Like, thank you for not fucking over my gaming experience by using predatory and unfair tactics to make people spend more money than they probably should. Like, is this how low we've gotten with our standards? I don't know, this is a bit of a tangent I guess, but it does not sit right with me. Anyways, the whole thing with RNG just makes me feel like it's not actually me who's playing the game. It's the game's RNG system that's controlling everything instead. RNG tells me which character I should play by giving me the character sigils and terminus weapons, and RNG tells me if I can make any actual progress with my power level through whether I'm actually going to get a good sigil or not. I just really hate how this whole thing works. To have RNG as the determinant factor for a game's reward system essentially ruins the reward itself, because the reward is not necessarily granted to those who actually performed well or have put a lot of effort or investment into the game. And I'm not talking about spending time farming or spending money as a kind of investment. Everyone do get the same percentage rate. RNG is definitely equal to all, but it is not fair. And the unfairness of the reward system is what undermines the reward itself, with the reward no longer connected to the things that people actually value. And if a game does not respect your time and effort on a systematic level, then I see no reason to respect it back. The game's fundamental systems are essentially non-existent because everything is taken care of by the RNG system. And this actually leads to my next big issue with the game, how the game as a whole now just feels...
You ungrateful creatures!
Here I am talking more specifically about the appearance of the game, like with the art style, the special effects, the music, the story, and so on. The things that you experience more immediately with your senses, and how Relink has either wasted its assets' potential due to them being put in a subpar game, or it's just the asset itself is kind of bad. Let's first begin with the visuals. I think the game visually is at best a passing grade. Putting all the special effects and stuff aside first, on the base level, the whole thing does not really look unique or distinguishable amongst a lot of the other games with a similar 3D anime art style that had come out in the, say, past half a decade. It's not that I don't like anime or being not used to the art style in general, but I just think Relink kind of looks plain, even for anime standards. Maybe it's just me, but I think I'm getting some kind of visual fatigue with this kind of style in general, I guess. I just prefer things that are more stylized. Like, I even say that I would prefer what classic World of Warcraft has over Relinks, because it's at least something that's memorable, and not some kind of baby's first anime game looking as. I think Relink also has a mismatching issue with its style, like how none of the characters really look like they belong to this world. There's like this weird contrast between the smooth humans and the non-human parts, like with the armor or feathers. It looks like something where the actual 3D model is not really something that detailed, but the paint job that was done was desperately trying to make there appear to be some kind of texture. And also, I don't really like the weird outline thing they have here. I didn't like it when MMD first had something like that, and I still don't like it now. And that was just with the base look of the game. Now, what about the special effects they've added? Is the flashiness somehow able to make it a bit better? No. In fact, to me, the flashiness is what actually made the whole thing look even worse. The special effects in Relink is just way overdone, and it made the game look cheap and desperate instead. The overall visuals are more distracting and overwhelming than anything else as a result, and feel more like visual garbage than actually enhancing the experience. Like, look at this Steam store page picture. I honestly could barely figure out what the hell I was looking at the first time I saw it. And it was equally messy when that actual scene appeared in-game. Relink relies too much on the sparks and colors, as if it's trying to tell the player how to think about the game. Like, hey, look at all this flashiness, this is cool, so you should react as if you are looking at something cool. It's the same case with how shitty horror games rely on cheap jump scares to scare the players, like a comedian that comes off stage to tickle the audience to make them laugh. And this is why I call the game feeling superficial. Instead of having the assets be connected to the actual game and with each other in some way, they feel more like random stuff tossed in just because they look nice individually. Does this fire your neurons? Okay, add it in then. There's no real consideration for an actual coherent art direction, resulting in the game looking very much soulless. It just ends up coming off as a desperate attempt to make the player feel special about the stuff they're doing in the game. I'm just doing some very basic controls here and spamming my attack buttons, yet I am getting all sorts of flashes and effects and numbers going on. But when the game is making every little thing look special, then nothing really is. Like, honestly, while playing this game, my eyes actually started to kind of hurt from all of this. Instead of enhancing the experience, the special effects in Relink are implemented more like dopamine triggers, and it really reminds you of the gacha game background that this game came from.
Listen, my son just got tons of legendary heroes with 2 million power. He can kill 1,000 zombies in seconds. What makes you think you're good enough for my son? Sign the divorce agreement now!
But I think this is a thing with many Eastern RPGs in general. Like, even with Final Fantasy XIV, the limit breaks really only have 5 different actual effects, and they're all very simple ones as well. Yet all jobs get their own visuals that can be very distracting at times. It's the thing where the actions can certainly look cool, but do not really feel like so when you actually use them because of how simple the action actually is. Like, personally, I find Machinist's chainsaw action very much like that, where it's just a simple DPS button you press off cooldown, no need for build up or anything, despite what the visuals are trying to tell you otherwise. Another good example, I think, is MapleStory, and also just everything it has, but especially the damage numbers, are really overdone. After a certain point, it just begins to feel arbitrary and meaningless, yet the game is still trying to make it as if it's a big deal with how it's being presented. When you are being told special for everything you do, then nothing would feel special anymore. The value of special becomes lost. But that's it with the visuals. I won't comment too much on the music because I don't really remember much of it, and I think the main culprit is actually the game itself and how it doesn't have the right content to support the music it has. Since the game itself was not exactly impactful in any way to me, the music, which is what I consider as experience enhancers, was not really able to properly do its thing. Because, well, 0 multiplied by anything is still going to be 0. I'm not saying that the music's OST in itself is bad or boring. Instead, I'm trying to judge the music in its entirety under the context of it being played in a video game, with the specific situations and scenarios they appear in. Also, this is not a rhythm game where music takes up most of the game's identity, and having good music in a bad game does not make the game better. It only makes the music feel more like a waste, as it was not able to get the appropriate accompaniment. I've got to be honest here, the game really bored me out at times, and the music was not able to make the situation better. When doing a story quest and fighting Bahamut Versa, despite how intense the music was getting with the vocals and the instruments, it only contrasted further with how bored I was with the story and the fight at the time. And that sense of boredness was what instead enhanced. Like, why is the music going so hard when I'm really just chilling here? It doesn't feel right. It didn't fit the emotions I was actually experiencing. It felt more like the game was trying to push some kind of emotions onto me, like telling me I should be feeling some kind of way, but I just didn't get it. I think the people who were responsible for the art and the music for this game were definitely trying to make something work here, but they just missed the mark on multiple ends due to what I believe to be a lack of coordination and a lack of a competent game to contain these assets. The result is not like bad where it can actually get some kind of emotions out of me, or so bad that it actually can go back around to being interesting again. Instead, it's stuck at this awkward position where it's not exactly in the realm of being good, but just lukewarm, like wanting to be good but just could not reach it in the end. It's bland in the worst way possible. The game feels and looks superficial because of the lack of actual substance underneath to support these things, and instead they just feel like their entire purpose is to get the player's neurons firing, and that they were not made because they seem like good and fitting features to be added onto the game. They were like special tools that were created to manipulate emotions, and it's really unfortunate that's what they came to be. And this is what my final verdict with this game is. That Relink is really hollow.
It's empty! Just like my soul!
The game has only maybe achieved to make itself appear good, but has no real substance underneath all of its flashiness. It lacks both quantity and quality, yet still pushes the player to keep grinding whatever little bit of content it has. Character progression barely exists because most of it is just RNG, and whatever is there is extremely linear and just plain grindy, since the point of them is just to unlock everything anyways. No sense of personal choice in the matter. And actually, never mind, that little bit of character progression is still RNG because overmastery is an actual thing that exists. This game just feels like it has an entirely different design philosophy that I am just so unfamiliar with. Maybe if it actually were a mobile game, I wouldn't have been so harsh with it. Relink feels like it is pretending to be an actual full price game. And if this is the direction that video games are gonna go towards, and these are the types of games that people are going to praise in the future, then honestly, it might be an exaggeration, but I'm worried about where video games are gonna go in the future. Am I being too negative here? Yes, probably, but I'm really out of goodwill at this point. I say that the game ultimately feels hollow because despite all these things the game has that tries to agitate your senses, they are nothing more than just cover-ups for its bare-bone and surface-level approach to game design. And it doesn't help with how the game basically betrays its players by setting up false promises and expectations, and then never really fulfilling them. So many things about this game seems to be self-contradicting or self-defeating in some way. Like the devs just don't know what to really do with it and kept changing their minds as the development period went on. Relink started very RPG-like, with you traversing through maps and picking up random stuff off the ground, fighting packs of mobs. All in all, just a very standard RPG kind of gameplay, with nothing to really dislike about, though there wasn't much to like about either. But it was just the beginning, so I gave it a pass. But later on, they seemingly abandoned that idea and started to focus more on arena-based boss fights, which to me says that they basically gave up on trying to build an actual world in the game for people to get immersed in, as up until then, there was no world to really experience or explore. Everything was already linear, and it was going to go even further and abandon the line altogether and just have a dot instead. In the middle of the story, I thought the game was going to pull back a bit with the desert map when they first introduced it. The map was really empty and poorly designed. I did not enjoy the sand surfing part at all, but it gave me some hope at least that it was going to introduce more of the world to me. But that whole thing was just completely abandoned after basically the quest that introduced it, and we went back to arenas very quickly. Even for the big robot boss, it was really just a larger arena and wasn't really a map in itself. They even kept the sand surfing aspect and didn't keep the actual map. So I don't know what they were thinking. The game also introduced the concept of elements very early on, and I foolishly thought that this was going to be an important feature of the game. Damage cap, or elemental, and playing bosses. All these things defeat the purpose of having elements in the first place. And now I just feel stupid for ever trying to balance my team's element out and getting good coverage for the first half of the main story quests. The early half of the game and everything else are really like two different games designed by two different teams of people with two different directions. And the second team came because the company didn't want to actually spend more time and money and effort anymore. Hence why we get all this half-assed content and systems in the game. The game feels hollow because that's exactly what it is. It's like a grade schooler's homework that was copy-pasted from Wikipedia and just had some words changed out. I feel like little to no effort was put into making any parts of the game. It tried to have some interesting mechanics in the beginning, but they just ended up only being very surface level and never went deeper than that. The consequence of having huge inconsistencies like these is that it betrays the player's early impression and expectations of the game, and renders their early to mid-game experience essentially meaningless. The game is incidentally calling the player stupid for thinking that the game is gonna go one way, but then have the entire direction turn and 180. all the initial impressions are disconnected from the actual game because of how drastically different the game feels in the later stages. If the game was going to turn out like this, what did I spend all my previous hours for? What was the game that I was playing before all of this? Where did all these maps go? Where did all these mechanics go? All that attention and effort put into this game early on are just rendered useless. But all these aside, I think when it really came down to it, Relink was not enjoyable because the combat sucked. The battle content, the main point of an action RPG game, was not that fun. But let's get this out of the way first. The combat control of Relink is definitely smooth. It's very responsive and does not feel awkward to play. But is an action game having decent control really something praiseworthy for essentially doing the bare minimum? The thing is, I think when evaluating how good a game's combat is, it's not just about having smooth controls. We should also have to consider how the player control actually connects to the gameplay. To put it rather bluntly, if the thing that is smooth is just a piece of shit, then all you get is a smooth shit. How good the control feel is merely the adjective to the actual noun that is the actual gameplay. And this is where I think Relink is truly incomparable to Monster Hunter and Final Fantasy XIV, and how differently they treat their battle content, and why Relink's battle content is so far behind when compared to the other two. The thing is, Monster Hunter and Final Fantasy XIV all have content that you can make emotional connections with, along with having combat that actually has some sense of depth, while Relink, in comparison, is much more lacking on both of these aspects. This is also where I'll be addressing the comparisons between the games the most, so let's get the easy stuff out of the way first. When people compare these games, especially between Relink and Monster Hunter, they usually mention the similarities in the general frameworks, like how they're all 4-player co-op ARPGs with some elements of part breaking and material collecting, and all have the endgame RNG grind. Well, regarding the RNG grind for decorations or sigils, I think I've said enough already. So what about the other points? The whole thing about 4-player co-op ARPG shouldn't really need much explanation. Like, the 4-player part is just about the max number of players that can be involved in the gameplay, and the ARPG is just a very general indication for the genre that the game is a part of. So we can really just disregard these first and foremost. Though with regards to the part breaking and material gathering, similar to how decorations and sigils differ in their level of importance and necessity in their respective games, these points also play out very differently in both games. Part breaking, first of all, is definitely a much more prevalent feature in Monster Hunter. Although part breaking certainly exists in Relink, it really feels more like a forgotten feature more than anything. There's nothing in the game that really reminds you about this feature, nor does the game really utilizes this feature in any discernible way. In Monster Hunter, breaking parts would actually affect enemy behavior and reward the player with bonuses such as easier fights or extra materials. But in Relink, this feature is mostly forgotten. You do get some bonus materials for some of the bosses, but the game doesn't really even make it easy to target particular parts, nor does breaking parts really change anything about the actual combat experience. It's just a side quest that you really don't have to be bothered with, because from what I can see, I think the game also doesn't really want you to bother with that either. Part breaking is more like something that you just happen to do every once in a while, rather than something that you sometimes want to actively go for. And with how shitty the targeting system is in Relink, you can't really part break that efficiently and reliably either. Now let's talk about material gathering and crafting. This one kind of goes both ways. One being too simple and generalized that it's not really worth mentioning, like the 4-player ARPG thing. Or we can actually go deeper with it and see how Monster Hunter is able to give its materials and crafting system uniqueness, depth, and immersion, way more stuff than what Relink can offer. And this is how I think Monster Hunter was able to make material gathering such a distinguished feature than what Relink has, by making both the monsters you fight and the weapons and armor pieces you use the materials for be connected thematically. Let's take Nargacuga as an example here. Nargacuga is mostly known for its agility and sharp characteristics, and you not only can see this from its appearance, but also through the actual fight itself, where it uses its spikes and blades when it does attacks and likes to jump around a lot. Then you can use its materials for things that embody those very unique and distinguishable characteristics, not just through visual appearance. And visual representation of player effort is something that Relink also doesn't have. Just mentioning this as a side note. The Nargacuga weapons represent the sharpness of the monster, granting the highest base crit chance in any weapon's entire weapon tree, while the Nargacuga armor pieces focus more on the monster's agile side, granting armor skills that usually focus more on evasion, stamina, and also crit chance. Even for things that do not have any visual representation, the crafted decorations also follow this rule, where in Rise Sunbreak, we see that the key rare material for making Tenderizer Jewel is the Narga Medulla. The whole system not only reinforces the monster's own character and uniqueness, but also rewards the player by making their specific kind of effort being put in being properly shown and represented, or to go a bit further with this, respected. Like, it would feel pretty weird if I fight a water type monster, but end up using its materials for things that have nothing to do with water, right? In this scenario, my interpretation would be that the game itself does not care what the player does with the game or its content, that there is no consideration for cohesiveness in its themes. The game does not care what kind of challenges you took upon, and it does not care what kind of rewards it is going to give you. And this is basically what Relink is like and made me feel during my experience with it. The materials for upgrades and crafting are all basically arbitrary and unrelated to the challenges that provided these materials themselves, though I guess there aren't many different challenges to begin with. The materials gathered for everything in the game are much less about the specific challenges the player took upon and the kind of effort they've put in, but instead is much more just a general showing of progress of the level of difficulty that the player has achieved. There is no griffin weapon or goblin weapon to craft, and it's more like extreme level weapon or proud level weapon. I mean, just look at this crafting list for this weapon that is for a fire type character, Percival. Water Orb, Bizarre Ice Spine, and Bizarre Wings, all from a boss that is located in an ice environment. It's really not even trying at this point. There's maybe the conceptual separation of defensive sigils and offensive sigils, but even then the materials used are still very basic and, once again, more about the level of difficulty than the enemies themselves. It's just mostly Black Worm and Id materials for the offensive sigils, and White Worm and Mag materials for the defensive sigils. Black Worm and White Worm, sure, but the Robot, Id, and Mag for all these different types of effects? Yeah, there's really no thought put into this. The game does not try to distinguish or grant uniqueness to the sigils or its bosses. This means that the game basically has failed to prevent itself from, ironically, being gamified, and has its uniqueness and character removed from itself. Although I guess they weren't really there in the first place for this game. Stuff like these are what really separates these two games apart in how they approach not just their battle content, but also what the player does those content for. Monster Hunter is more like a hunting game, focusing on creating a world with natural inhabitants that feel and behave organically, on top of being a really good action game. While for Relink, it is much simpler with its approach to this, and instead of trying to actually create a world for the players to enjoy and get immersed in, it completely doubled down on the fast-paced, arena-based boss fights, which do not require any real world building, nor do they add anything to the world building itself either. Relink is simply not a game about depth or immersion, and it's certainly not trying to be one either. It is a fast food type of game with the sole purpose of granting an instantaneous sense of gratification that is, unfortunately, for me at least, not long lasting. Other games have things that can slowly sink into you and entice you to them deeply, and have plenty of them ready as well. But Relink has nothing that can even begin to get deeper than just being surface level, nor does it have much content to satisfy the player to begin with. The game pretends to have all these different features, but never really went through with any of them. You may say that they took inspiration from all these other games, but really it's in name only. Just, again, I hate repeating myself here, but just surface level stuff. But even with all these, we're still not getting to the actual core of the issue. All of what I've mentioned up until now are more or less additive to what Relink really is like as a game, since I was talking more or less about the game's issue with its immersion. Now let's finally take a look at the actual combat design issue that I first mentioned, which is also what I believe to be the actual weakest aspect of Relink as a game. As the foundation of an action game, Relink's combat design is simply not engaging in any way that I would call fun, or at least not fun enough to get me hooked, as there is nothing to get hooked onto anyways. First of all, remember what I said way before about how the value of special becomes lost when you are being told special for everything you do? This is what I was alluding to, how Relink's combat lacks balance for the player input and the outcome. By making the player do flashy special things with little to no effort, it actually devalues the act of player input. If you're doing a task that requires minimal attention, then you can imagine how that task can become very boring very quickly, compared to if the task requires a bit more attention and maybe even requiring some spontaneous strategic thinking. Relink's combat is closer to mindless spam than what both Monster Hunter and Final Fantasy XIV have, because in those games, player input actually requires some level of consideration, albeit each done in very different ways. For Monster Hunter, the attacks have risks involved, so much so that the game kind of plays more like a turn-based game, where you really have to take each of your moves very carefully. The attack animations actually matter for the weapons, and that's what gives the player input weight and meaning, as attacking becomes a strategic choice that the player has to make moment to moment. This is why in World Iceborne, the bowguns are so damn strong, because they remove the need for the player to think about their actions, since for these weapons, they just have to dodge or block the incoming attacks, and do not have to worry about the cost of attacking. And Final Fantasy XIV has something completely different. Most jobs in the game more or less follow a strict combat rotation, with specific combos that you have to do and keep up with. But with this strictness, though the game's combat certainly loses its sense of freedom and choice, rotation maintenance become the thing that would require the player to pay attention to the most instead. As long as the rotation is interesting, the player will be required to engage with the content with a lot more care. This is also why healers in Final Fantasy XIV, when compared to other jobs in other roles, feel more boring to play. And one of the biggest complaints you hear is about how the healer DPS rotation is severely lacking, only having a single spamming filler spell and a dot to play with. Now, what does Relink have? On the surface, there seems to be quite a bit going on with all the different characters. Having all these different combos and skills to use makes the combat seem rather interesting. But the reality is, although there certainly is variety, there isn't really much depth with any of them. For the combos that the characters have, they play out more like spamming attacks for how most of the characters play. You get some that do have this timing gimmick attached, or some with this charge attack thing going on, but it doesn't change the fact that despite how different the type of player input is varied, the input itself still lacks the depth needed for more player attention towards what they're actually doing. It's like a buffet where there's all sorts of different dishes out there, but none of them are really particularly good. Some can even be kind of bad. You get the quantity, but not necessarily the quality. The skills are basically the same. You mostly just use them off cooldown or in between the attacks if there's some kind of interaction, but most of the time you're just spamming them as well. Relink does not create any real build-up or sense of necessity to make the player become actually engaged with how they play the game, and this results in the player input becoming devalued. Relink's combat is just too forgiving. The animation canceling, the dodging, and blocking, they all come too easily and are way too efficient. Any sense of cost of making offensive decisions with your actions is essentially removed. So when you attack in Relink, you're not really making any moment-to-moment decisions here, but more just mindlessly doing something to keep your hands busy. That also just happens to drop the enemy HP down. Because of how efficient the animation canceling, dodging, and blocking mechanics are, the player is able to nullify their mistakes and avoid punishment way too easily, hence further devaluing the importance of player input in the game's combat. And the result is we get a game's combat that is so boring that it's boring not just because it's too easy to control or maneuver, there's also not enough punishment from the game side to encourage players to pay more attention to the game. In Monster Hunter, it is a pretty big deal if you get hit, because it makes you vulnerable and prone to get hit again. And in order to make yourself safer, you have to forgo your offensive options, aka sheathing your weapon. And while you're healing, you're actually only relatively safer than before. You're still kind of vulnerable in the end, because it takes time for you to drink potions. This is why instant heals like max potions or healing powders are so prioritized and nice to have, because less time equals less cost in player action. You're also discouraged to cart too easily, because not only you'll fail your quest that way, it is also a pretty long run back for you to get back to the monster from your base. And it can be quite a pain to deal with, while also being a huge waste on your buff's timer. All of these create a complete punishment system that is not just there to annoy the player, but to actually encourage them to improve on themselves and focus more. Because of these punishments, it just feels so much better when you actually do learn to fight better, whether it is learning the intricacies of the weapon you're using, or getting used to the behavioral patterns of the monsters, where you're able to do the right attacks at the right times. The combat experience of Monster Hunter is a fulfilling one, and that is why it is so addicting and memorable. Now, for Final Fantasy XIV, although I do agree that the whole arena-based boss fight format is very similar to what Relink has, there is still a huge difference between how both games approach combat design with the bosses. Final Fantasy XIV's bosses simply require more teamwork and coordination, and the content actually connects with the player more on an emotional level. While Relink is more like a single-player first, multiplayer fourth kind of game with not a lot of things that really evoke player emotions. Despite being a 4-player co-op game, the co-op aspect of Relink is more just about the fact that you can play together in a team of 4, but nothing about the game really fundamentally encourages the player to play the game with 3 other actual people. The actual gameplay plays out more of a everyone for themselves kind of way. And the point of the game being co-op is basically lost, as the fight themselves don't really change in any significant way whether you're soloing or doing them with a full team anyways. The only reason for you to bring more real people in is to kill the boss faster, because the HP apparently does not scale down. And instead of trying to get all of your other characters geared up, it's just much better to get real people who have already geared themselves up, who will deal much more damage than your AI teammates. But that's kind of the only point with playing with real people, since the AI teammates can often be much more reliable than some randoms you match up with. And this becomes much more crucial when the enemy attacks get that much more fatal in the later stages. So unless you're playing with people you know, you probably don't want to bother with the matchmaking process anyways, possibly even unintentionally discouraged by the game itself because of how reliable the AI can be. How Relink fundamentally plays like is a single-player game with content that you can occasionally play with other people. But the content itself, other than the fact that it has a very long health bar, is not really designed oriented around being played by 4 people. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy XIV not only has this need for teamwork due to its fundamental framework with the tank healer DPS roles, team play is essential also due to how the fights themselves are designed, where there are a lot of mechanics and gimmicks that require group coordination to get through. When you accomplish something with a group, it feels so much better than just doing it by yourself. And the other key thing here is how the sense of joy accomplishment you get from finally getting over these challenges is actually further amplified with how punishing the game is, despite how it has a similar arena-based boss fight format as Relink. When you mess up in the harder content of Final Fantasy XIV, the punishment for making mistakes is just falling to the ground for a short while and then picking yourself back up and returning to the fight immediately as if nothing really had happened. But because of how team-oriented the fights are designed in Final Fantasy XIV, in a lot of cases where even just one person messes up, it usually means the end for the entire team, that it is going to be a wipe. For single-player games like Relink, each individual's responsibility is very light because the game does not put any on the players anyways. But in Final Fantasy XIV, the players kind of have to function more like interconnected gears in a machine, where the individual player input is not just for themselves, but also shouldering the responsibility they have for their other teammates. And even for instances where a single member messing up does not affect the team as a whole, the game still makes sure to punish that player accordingly, with things like damage down or rest sickness debuff. And don't forget about how if you die, you also mess up your DPS rotation, meaning that you'll become unsynced with the team and miss out on the coordinated team burst windows. This is a kind of indirect punishment that just makes you feel bad without any huge negative consequences attached. And in terms of emotional engagement, I'm mostly talking about how in Final Fantasy XIV, like with the trials, the player can still have an emotional attachment or connection to the game because of how the battle content is so deeply connected to its story content, and its story content also being very well made. Which I think no one will disagree with me on this if I say that Relink does not have the same level of story to really hold things together here. In the end, compared to Final Fantasy XIV, Relink does not have the same level of combat design, nor does it have the sufficient tools to help the players to make a deeper and more emotional connection with the game and its content. All in all, it's just incomparable in all aspects. Relink lacks the level of intricate design for the player input to be inherently meaningful, while also lacking the external push for the content itself for the player to engage with in deeper ways, leading to the final result of having a bare bones combat system that is close to being brain dead, and lackluster content that only has an increase in numbers, but nothing that's actually substantial and meaningful. And also, just on a final side note, on the topic of story, I really dislike how they implemented the extra story in the form of Fate episodes. I think Fate episodes really messed up the pacing and progression of the main storyline in a very big way. The Fate episodes, or the character stories, are essentially must-dos because they not only grant decent base stats, but most importantly, they also grant 2 sigil slots. Why can't the character stories just be something in the logs you can read over whenever you feel like? Why does it have to be this thing that you must do to essentially fully unlock the character? Especially when there's 22 characters now? It's quite a lot to get through. If I want more story, I'll go check it out on my own terms. Why have it force-fed? The pure text Fate episodes aren't even fully skippable, and instead they have this irritating half-assed skip that only skips the current portion of the text. My thumb was hurting for the entire next day after just getting the stats for the new characters that I wanted to bring onto my team. But even with that aside, it's not like the gameplay episodes offer anything new or interesting either. It's just the same recycled maps and enemies presented as some kind of tutorial for the character. But if they wanted to just make a tutorial for the characters, they could have just had a separate optional quest for each character and not have them as must-do quests. Even in Monster Hunter with its 14 weapons, you only really get the general control tutorial that was a must-do. And the weapons are more or less left for the player themselves to figure out, and I really like that. It really feels like they were just artificially padding out the playtime again here. Final Fantasy XIV is able to have long job quests because the game itself is already very big, and the leveling jobs takes time to do. So when compared to the huge amount of story quests the game has, just having a few extra job quests aren't really that significant anymore. I've just spent like an hour explaining why I didn't find the game fun. Am I being too harsh on it? Probably, but do I regret wasting so much time and effort on this video that no one will ever watch? Not really. because this is just how I honestly feel about this game. I mean, taking a step back, despite all that I've said, Relink, just judging it by itself, is really just okay. There's no real great sin of any kind it's committing here, and this really is just an issue with my taste and the game not matching, more than there being something objectively and fundamentally so problematic that is breaking the game apart. I've basically held it to a standard that's probably too high for it, and that is really unfair on my part. Like, obviously there are several things that I prioritize differently than those that left these good comments about the game. I think I just don't get why people compare Relink to these other games that I think are either completely different or just so much better that they're just on another league and completely incomparable. And this, I think, really frustrated me. Relink, I think, is more like a mobile game with a PC and console port than something that was actually initially developed for these platforms. The game does not seem to be utilizing all it can with all the resources and the lack of technical limitations that these platforms have compared to developing mobile games, and praising the game as if it had done the same as what a good PC or console game would, I think is just wrong. But maybe this is the future of gaming, I don't know, but I don't like the direction everything is going. It has too many things that reminds me of these other things that I already don't really like. Maybe I just need to let myself experience more of these types of games to open up my mind a bit more. And I guess I just sound like a grumpy old man complaining about all sorts of things in this video, but I don't think the oversimplification of so many different things in this game is really something I personally like to see in games nowadays or in the future. Optimization, sure, but simplification, and especially oversimplification like what Relink has, I do not like it. But anyways, like I said in the beginning, this was not a game review of any kind really, and is more of a rant. If I were asked what will make me less upset about this game, then I guess it would be, first of all, that people need to stop praising this game more than what it really is. And two, this should not be a full price game because the end result is not something worthy of that price at all. It's really an issue about what I personally think the game deserves to have, I guess. And this is definitely a very subjective topic. So I don't expect people to really agree with me with whatever I have had to say in this video. But nonetheless, thank you for willing to hear what I have to say until now, if you have. And goodbye.